Hello Year 12s and welcome to this, the second video in our series of 2 videos on key concepts in the Victorian civil justice system.
The nightclubs are pumping, but before you join in the fun, it's time to do a bit of legal studies homework. There are 3 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. First, take the very best Cornell notes that you can. Second, use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you've missed any information and you want to go back over that information. And the third thing that you need to do is to have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of key terms and of any other words that you may be unfamiliar with.
On this slide, I've set out the learning intention for this video. Write this learning intention down in your Cornell notes. This learning intention requires you to be able to explain why a case is a civil case. On this slide, I have illustrated the language and concepts that are relevant to a civil case. In a civil case, there are 2 parties. The first party is the plaintiff. The plaintiff is the party who claims that another party has committed a civil wrong. The second party is the defendant. The defendant is the party who is alleged to have committed the civil wrong. In a civil case, a plaintiff sues a defendant. Sue means to take legal action against a party in a civil case. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the word sue and write that definition in there. A plaintiff can sue a defendant for a range of civil wrongs or civil causes of action. I have listed some of these here and on the next slide. The most common types of civil wrongs are breach of contract, negligence, defamation, nuisance, and trespass. Breach of contract is where one party does not comply with, that is, breaches, an agreement that that party has with another party. Negligence is where one party causes loss to another party by failing to exercise reasonable care. Defamation is where one party damages the reputation of another party by making untrue statements. Nuisance is where one party interferes with another party's enjoyment of their rights, for example, as where a factory emits pollution that prevents a neighbour from enjoying clean air. And trespass is where one party physically interferes with another party or their property, for example, as where a person goes onto another's land without permission or destroys another's property or injures another person. It is the plaintiff who is responsible for proving that the defendant committed the civil wrong. That is, it is the plaintiff who has the burden or onus of proof in a civil case. The standard of proof is the strength of evidence needed to prove a case. In a civil case, this standard of proof is on the balance of probabilities, which means that it must be more likely than not that the defendant has committed the civil wrong. If the plaintiff cannot prove on the balance of probabilities that the defendant committed the civil wrong, then the plaintiff's claim must be dismissed and the defendant is not liable for the civil wrong. If the plaintiff proves on the balance of probabilities that the defendant committed the civil wrong, then the plaintiff's claim must be upheld and the defendant is liable for the civil wrong. Notice the language that is being used. Claim dismissed, defendant is not liable, claim upheld, defendant is liable. Where a defendant is liable, this means that the defendant has legal responsibility for their actions or omissions. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term liable and write that definition in there. This language is very different from the language that is used in a criminal case. In a criminal case, the accused is either guilty or not guilty. In contrast, in a civil case, the defendant is either liable or not liable. It is very important not to confuse criminal law language with civil law language. Where a plaintiff's claim is upheld, then the plaintiff will be entitled to a civil remedy. Civil remedies include damages, that is compensation, and injunctions, that is a court order that the defendant must do something or must not do something.
This slide simply states in words what is illustrated on the previous slide, so I'll leave you to read this slide for yourselves. But note the words in bold. These are words that indicate that a case is a civil case.
Using the language and concepts referred to in the previous slides,
see if you can explain why this case is a civil case. In this case, Nikki agrees to sell her car to Sharon for $5,000. However, when Sharon turns up to collect the car from Nikki's place, Nikki tells Sharon that she has already sold the car to Ali for $6,000. Sharon, as the plaintiff, sues Nikki as the defendant for breach of contract in the magistrate's court. The magistrate is persuaded on the balance of probabilities that Nikki has breached her contract with Sharon. Accordingly, the magistrate upholds Sharon's claim and orders Nikki to pay Sharon $1,200 in damages to compensate Sharon for the breach of contract. Now pause this video for a while and see if you can identify all of the language used in this case study which suggests that this case is a civil case. Well, hopefully by now you have had an opportunity to look at the language used in this case scenario and identify that language which indicates that this is a civil case. Let's start off by looking at the vocabulary that is being used. In this case, we see that Sharon, as the plaintiff, sues Nikki as the defendant. We know that in a civil case there are two parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, and that the plaintiff sues, that is, takes legal proceedings against the defendant. In addition, we see that the magistrate is persuaded on the balance of probabilities that Nikki has breached her contract. The standard of proof in a civil case is on the balance of probabilities, which means that it is more likely than not that Nikki has breached her contract with Sharon. Again, this indicates that we are dealing with a civil case. And finally, we can see that the magistrate upholds Sharon's claim as the plaintiff. Again, the concept of upholding a claim or dismissing a claim is consistent with the case being a civil case. Turning now to the cause of action. Sharon has sued Nikki for breach of contract. Breach of contract is a civil cause of action or is a civil wrong. And finally, we can look at the consequence for Nikki of breaching the contract. In this case, the consequence is that the magistrate orders Nikki to pay Sharon damages in the amount of $1,200. Again, damages is a civil remedy. So you can see, bringing all of this together, looking at the vocabulary, that is, plaintiff, sues, defendant, balance of probabilities, upholds the plaintiff's claim. Looking at the cause of action, or the civil wrong, that is, breach of contract. And looking at the consequences of that civil wrong, that is, damages. All of these factors add up to indicate to us that this is a civil case. Now, a word of warning. You can see that we have referred to Nikki paying Sharon $1,200 in damages. Damages, with the S, is a reference to compensation. Do not confuse this with damage. Damage is a reference to the injury or loss that the plaintiff might suffer. You must not use the word damages instead of damage, or damage instead of damages.
Well, that brings us to the end of this video, and indeed the series of 2 videos on key concepts in the Victorian civil justice system. As a result of watching this video and taking notes, you should now be able to explain why a case is a civil case. Thank you for your attention.